A young African-American goes searching for his family history in an abandoned Iowa coal town where blacks and whites lived side by side and blacks thrived.
A gentleman that I was talking to said in Buxton, we had our own lawyers, we had our own doctors and dentists and school teachers, and then we moved to Des Moines and stepped back 100 years.
Searching for Buxton. Funding for Searching for Buxton has been provided by William Penn University and Musco Lighting, who are proud to support the telling of this Iowa story. I'm Simon Estes. As an African American and as the son of a miner, the story we're about to tell you is very special to me. It's about a little known but remarkable chapter in America's complicated racial history. It occurred in a small Iowa coal mining community, Buxton. It was a place so unusual, the blacks who grew up and worked there nearly 100 years ago knew little of prejudice and segregation, only discovering them once they left town. What made Buxton so extraordinary? Last summer, Jason Madison, whose great-grandfather was a miner there, went searching for Buxton.
I tell you, Buxton, it was a place you wouldn't believe, because it sounds like a fairyland.
If you travel the country roads of south central Iowa, over the rolling hills and through the cornfields, you eventually might find your way to a severely overgrown area. There, the tall grass and weeds conceal an extraordinary chapter in America's history. This is what Buxton looks like today. This is what it looked like 100 years ago. Dr. David Gradwell, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Iowa State University, visited this site in the late 70s when the excavation of Buxton began.
It was a shock to me to see how much of that town had disappeared based on photographs from the early 20th century. I've worked and traveled on sites in England and in Europe, where you look at a Roman site and, there's not that much left maybe after 2,000 years. But 60 years, it gives you a very humble feeling about your place in the universe and your place in history.
In the 1970s and in the years since, bits of Buxton's lost history have been unearthed. Glass bottles, trolley tokens, old coins, the remnants of children's dolls, and artifacts that remind us that Buxton only existed because of the coal mines there. A miner's lunch pail, a miner's lamp, and 2 miners' hats. But these days, there's not much else to see in Buxton. And until recently, pretty much all Jason knew about that community was what he had learned years earlier when his dad and his grandma visited his first grade class in Greenwood Elementary in Des Moines.
She started going into a whole spiel about, what Buxton was, what it meant to her, and how it was totally different than any other small town here in Iowa. And that's how I was able to kind of learn about it.
Last summer, nearly 20 years later, Jason set out from Des Moines to document the town's history and his family's years there. There are a few remaining survivors from Buxton, but luckily for him, 2 of them happen to be relatives.
That's the unique thing about this whole project. This project has allowed me to find out who I am and what this town of Buxton, what my family's about. And at this point, I'm kind of speechless.
Jason first traveled to Sacramento, California, where his great-aunt Catherine, now 95 years old, still lives independently. Catherine's last memory of Jason was as an infant. Now she was welcoming a 25-year-old into her home.
All of these folks over here are relatives of ours.
And soon she was sharing pictures of and stories about life in Buxton, especially about her dad, Jason's great-grandfather. He was a coal miner known as Sarge. His family moved there around the turn of the 20th century.
What is it that you remember about Buxton?
You really want to know? Is my daddy, and I would go to the railroad station to meet him when he got off the train coming in from the coal mines.
Was that a regular routine?
Regular routine, 5 days a week.
And I remember you saying that you would do that because you wanted to say that you were your father's favorite.
Yeah, I always thought so.
Was it just you, or did Grandma Geraldine join you as well?
Sometimes, but if I could leave her home, I would.
Years before great-aunt Catherine was born, Sarge's family had traveled to Iowa from Charlottesville, Virginia. They were among hundreds of African-American miners who made the journey. Mine work in Iowa presented an economic opportunity for poor black miners from the South, according to Dorothy Schweeder, a retired historian. Along with her Iowa State colleagues, she interviewed dozens of Buxton survivors more than 3 decades ago.
It's our understanding that the first African-American families who came in to work in the coal mines in southern Iowa, they were actually brought in as strike breakers. Once a black miner would arrive, he would write a letter to a brother, cousin, uncle, whatever, back in Tennessee, back in Virginia, and he would say, why don't you come here? You can get a job. The living conditions are good, and he would encourage friends and family to also come, and apparently a good many of them did.
Jason's family did just that. Once arrived in Buxton, they moved into a house like this restored model at the Nelson Pioneer Farm in Oskaloosa, Iowa. Most of the houses were built and owned by the Consolidation Coal Company, which was owned by and supplied the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. The houses in the company town lacked plumbing and electricity, but they were spacious.
We had a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen with old wood stove. And then we had 3 bedrooms upstairs. And that's how we slept. Nice big yard.
And the houses were rented out to miners arriving from other communities without regard to race.
Houses were assigned on the order of the people who came in. So you might have an African-American family, a white family, African-American family. In other words, they didn't assign certain groups to certain parts of town. It was just that next house that was available.
Which meant much of Buxton was thoroughly integrated.
Blacks and whites lived next to each other. They weren't strangers, they were neighbors.
As the 1910 census shows, a few blocks like East 8th and 9th Streets were overwhelmingly black, but just down the block, the population was split almost equally between whites and blacks. Most of the whites were immigrant workers, primarily from Sweden, Slovakia, and the British Isles. Jason's grandmother, Geraldine, was born in Buxton in 1920. Her memories of the town are much fainter than those of her older sisters. She was only 4 or 5 when the family left town in the mid-1920s, but she does have at least one very vivid memory of her early childhood. It involves the white woman next door.
I remember going next door every afternoon, and this German lady, she would rock me every afternoon. I'll always remember that. I'll always remember her. That was something I look forward to every day.
One of your sisters was actually named after, I think it was one of your younger sisters.
Yes, her middle name is Wilmina, and I'm sure that's a German name.
Living side by side, black kids and white kids also went to school together. This was Aunt Catherine around 1920 with a white classmate. Both were taught by a black teacher, something also extremely unusual for the time.
My first grade teacher was named Mrs. Billingsley. She couldn't have been prejudiced against the whites, and the white teachers weren't prejudiced against the blacks. They treated us all as one.
There were a couple of neighborhoods in and around Buxton that were practically all white, like East and West Swedetown. Swedish immigrant miners had made their way to Buxton for the same reason all those black miners from Virginia did. There was plenty of coal in the mines and plenty of money to be made extracting it. 1915 census figures show that a large majority of people in Buxton supported themselves in the mines. More than 60% of the whites and nearly 75% of the blacks worked in coal production.
From talking to my grandfather, I really don't think there was a racial situation. In fact, they never viewed it as, I don't think he knew what racism was. Being a foreman in the mine, he obviously, worked with what he called the colored people every day, and it was just a time when you worked together, but in the evenings or any off time, you just stayed with your group of people, and it wasn't really being segregated or anything like that. It was just, that's just what you did.
All these situations, integrated workplaces, integrated schools, mostly integrated neighborhoods, were highly unusual during that time. Keep in mind that in 1896, a few years before Buxton sprang to life, in a now infamous ruling known as Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court overwhelmingly rejected efforts to integrate railroad cars. And so segregation remained the law of the land for decades, both before and after Buxton achieved racial harmony. Not that the Supreme Court ruling had much bearing on life in Buxton. Jason's family had settled 3 or 4 blocks from downtown, and today his great-aunt still remembers ignoring her mother's warnings not to wander too far away. Instead, she delighted in walking downtown with her white pal.
Well, I would love to go to town and sightsee. And next door neighbor's little girl and I, we used to sneak off and go to town.
What would you go down there and sightsee?
Just look, just looking in the windows, buying us some candy, a popsicle or something, and walking down the street and looking in the windows.
Now, were these just like the windows of the company store, or were there clothing stores down there too?
Yeah, company store, clothing store, barber shop, yeah.
How much were candy and pop and things like that down there?
Oh, golly, you could get a popsicle for a penny. You could get a loaf of bread for 5 cents. Everything was much cheaper then than it is now.
Would you say African Americans were well paid?
I don't remember ever wanting something and didn't get it.
In fact, what was so unusual about Buxton was not just how well whites and blacks got along, but how well blacks there lived. This light-hearted photograph from the early 20th century pretty much says it all about how black people fared in Buxton. At the time, relatively few women worked outside the home, but the 1905 Monroe County Census shows that 7 of the town's 19 teachers were black women. So were 2 of the 3 music teachers and also one of Buxton's 2 stenographers. The town's only postmaster was a black woman. So was the only midwife. She delivered both black and white babies. Income data collected a decade later showed that black women teachers in Buxton typically earned 90% of what white women teachers made. The overwhelming percentage of African American men made their living working the mines. According to official census data, as far back as 1905, there were a number of black professionals and business owners in town as well. This is an undated photo of Buxton resident George Neal sitting in the tailor shop he owned. And this is George Neal with his family. The black miners were paid the same wages as the white ones, and many, like the Neals, were able to afford fine clothes and, in some cases, even to buy cars. One of Aunt Catherine's earliest memories is of the difficulties of driving in Buxton.
Let me tell you something. You know, they didn't have sidewalks and paved streets, and my father had a Model A, and we got stuck in the mud. He could not get the car out of the mud. So he goes down inside of the coal mines and brings a mule out. And then the mule pulls us out of the ditch.
Oh, wow.
And then he takes the mule back, and then we go on our way.
The town's general store, frequented by both whites and blacks, has been described as one of the best of that time west of Chicago. Buxton also had YMCAs, one with an indoor swimming pool, a reading room stocked with history books, and out-of-town newspapers from as far away as New York City.
The black man came to Buxton. He'd write his
In a documentary about Buxton, broadcast on Iowa Public Television some 30 years ago, the now deceased Marjorie Brown talked about the extraordinarily good times blacks there enjoyed. Her father was a miner and then an engineer. Her mother was a choir director.
I didn't know there was any other way to live. The black people had the ball team, the black people had the band, the black people had the hotel, the black people had the YMCA. In fact, Buxton was the only place in the world that had a dual building YMCA set up, one for the adults and one for the children. And I thought that's the way everybody in the world lived. When we think of lifestyle, I can truthfully tell you, I never in my life lived in a house where there wasn't a musical instrument, where there were not newspapers, where there were not books. I never ate at a bare table because they hadn't polished tables, hadn't come in style, so it was tablecloths. I never lived in a house that was uncarpeted. That was our lifestyle, and I wasn't alone. All of the youngsters that I played with, we all lived the same way.
But the good times in Buxton were drawing to a close by the mid-1920s. The coal deposits had been used up, and the town's miners had to move to other communities to find work. Without mining, there was no reason for the town to exist. It rapidly shut down and, as you've seen, all but disappeared. Once they moved, Buxton's black residents were confronted with a harsh new reality, which was really the way of the world at that time. Lower paying, often menial jobs, and racial slights they had never known growing up in Buxton. Marjorie Brown's family moved to Cedar Rapids. She quickly learned that all the talents she had acquired in Buxton were not appreciated, even a little there.
It was a brand new world. It was a brand new thing for me. I had to unlearn so much and then learn again. I had to unlearn that Marjorie was an important part of a community and learn again that she was second, third, fourth, or unknown.
David Gradwell was among those who conducted the interviews for the Iowa State University study.
When they moved to the larger communities, particularly the African Americans, they did not have the same opportunities. There were people who had high school and college education and had been working in high, sorts of positions in Buxton that couldn't get those jobs. I think there were, like teachers who became house cleaners when they moved into these other areas. We were just having a conversation at a Buxton Club meeting, And a gentleman that I was talking to said in Buxton, we had our own lawyers, we had our own doctors and dentists and school teachers, and then we moved to Des Moines and stepped back 100 years. And that really stuck with me.
After Buxton's decline, Sarge moved his family to another mining town, Bucknell. Then, a few years later, to Des Moines. Only then, as a teenager, did Catherine discover what was so commonplace at that time, segregation.
There was not one white family on that whole street. Now that's when I first became aware of there was a difference.
So you learned that from your neighbors and your new friends?
The kids at school. They called you black and everything else sometimes they called you. I think that's the first fight I had was someone had done something to Geraldine, your grandmother.
Yes.
And of course I had to jump in because she was my youngest sister.
Both Catherine and her kid sister, Geraldine, went on to graduate from college and have successful careers as teachers, and both insist neither race nor racism has defined their lives. Still, 70, even 80 years later, Catherine distinctly remembers a number of racist incidents once she left Buxton and moved to Des Moines. One occurred during high school.
There was a white girl that lost her purse. She couldn't find her purse. I was the only black student in that class. And guess what? She told the counselor, I used to remember her name, that I had taken her purse. In fact, she found it later. But do you think she came and said, I'm sorry? Nothing at all.
She says another incident occurred years later.
When I worked at the YWCA in Des Moines, Cat's drugstore was segregated. You remember that, do you? The railroad station was segregated. Then they bought in a little store that sold orange juice and sandwiches. So I was going to lunch and I said, I think I'll try this place. I went in there and ordered me orange juice and a sandwich. She gave me my orange juice in a paper container, and I was only black in there, and all the whites had a glass. So I says to her, why did you give me this drink in the paper? She said, because that is what we do. We don't serve black folks with a glass. I said, thank you, gave it back to her and walked out.
20 or 30 years later, Catherine's nephew and Jason's dad, Jerry Madison, grew up in Des Moines feeling demeaned. He was angered by what he considered the derogatory portrayal of blacks, including the song Old Black Joe. Old Black Joe. He's still bitter about having to sit in the balcony to see a movie at the Paramount Theater in Des Moines, about not being served at Katz's, just like his Aunt Catherine, and as an adult, about facing hostility from white homeowners when he performed his duties as a city housing inspector.
And I used to go to them places and they didn't expect a black person to come to their house. And so when I went there, what are you here for? I said, what do you mean? They didn't like me to tell them what to do about their property.
Throughout the reporting of this story, we were struck by how similar the language Jason, his great aunt, and his dad all used to describe a sense of being judged unfavorably by whites. Though the three of them are separated by age and circumstance, each describe moments when they say they were made to feel like outsiders, like the other. The 95-year-old recalls her early school days in Des Moines.
You felt bad because you didn't know what you had done to make them angry with you when you hadn't done anything.
Her nephew, Jerry, puts it this way.
You always put out there like you're doing something wrong or something, or if I'm not qualified or something, and what do you have to be, you have to really experience it. And I just can't just sit here and talk about this.
Even his son, Jason, who was still only 26 years old, describes his own pained feelings.
I don't want to say you can't relate to other people outside of your own race, but it becomes kind of a struggle, at times, and because you know that you're different. Oh yeah, good. I can't really speak on other individuals. I can only speak about, about myself. And just kind of growing up, you always thought there's always like a double standard, you would say. Like, you always had to prove yourself over and over and over. And it wears on you.
All of these complicated feelings about race that endure today makes what happened in Buxton that much more remarkable. To this day, no one quite knows why Buxton developed the way it did. Was it because the coal mine operators, the Buxton family, were spatially enlightened? Did it have anything to do with the concept of welfare capitalism that emerged during that era? Or something else altogether? Even those who have studied this almost unparalleled story of prosperity and harmony admit to being uncertain.
I think we really know a good bit about Buxton, but there are many things we don't know. And one of the great unknowns to me is, did John Buxton or Ben Buxton really envision something of an African-American utopia? Did they really see this as a place where racial harmony would exist, where families would be treated equally? When the men went into the mines, they would receive equal pay for equal work. We don't know that.
Whatever it was, Jason Madison and others now believe that what happened in Buxton needs to be taught in Iowa schools and nationally, that the story not be lost, that history be preserved.
Well, I think it's extremely important for young people and even old people to know where they fit into history. What is their place? We're not just little isolated specks floating out. And I guess that's what I find exciting. If that could exist at that time in Iowa, then why can't it exist all over the United States today?
If these tales weren't told and these stories from previous generations weren't told, we wouldn't have any idea about it. I mean, it's something that wasn't taught in the schools that much. This is definitely something that is unique to Iowa and definitely needs to be shared.
To find out more about Buxton, go to the Iowa Public Television website, iptv.org. I'm Simon Estes. Thank you for joining us. Funding for Searching for Buxton has been provided by William Penn University and Musco Lighting, who are proud to support the telling of this Iowa story.